Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read-aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read a lightly edited version of The Last Man by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, published in 1826. The book will be read in order, so if you would like to begin at the beginning, please start with Season 4, Episode 54. A quick content warning. This book contains occasional references to plague, pestilence, death, suicidal thoughts and actions, and in one section, brief descriptions of war and pillaging. We will try to include specific warnings in the episode descriptions, but if you prefer to avoid these topics altogether, we recommend re-listening to our previous seasons or rejoining us for our next book. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Exploration Dreamland. If you have a moment to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, it would help other listeners find us. You can also hear our episodes on YouTube. If you are listening there, please like our episodes and leave a comment for us. We'd love to hear from you. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. Chapter 7. I did proceed to Windsor, but not with the intention of remaining there. I went but to obtain the consent of Idris, and then to return and take my station beside my unequalled friend, to share his labors, and save him, if so it must be, at the expense of my life. Yet I dreaded to witness the anguish which my resolve might excite in Idris. I had vowed to my own heart never to shadow her countenance even with transient grief, and should I prove recreant at the hour of greatest need? I had begun my journey with anxious haste. Now I desired to draw it out through the course of days and months. I strove to escape from thought, vainly. Futurity, like a dark image in a phantasmagoria, came nearer and more near, till it clasped the whole earth in its shadow. A slight circumstance induced me to alter my usual route, and to return home by Egham and Bishopgate. I alighted at Perdita's ancient abode, her cottage, and, sending forward the carriage, determined to walk across the park to the castle. This spot, dedicated to sweetest recollections, the deserted house and neglected garden were well adapted to nurse my melancholy. In our happiest days, Perdita had adorned her cottage with every aid art might bring to that which nature had selected to favor. In the same spirit of exaggeration she had, on the event of her separation from Raymond, caused it to be entirely neglected. It was now in ruin. The deer had climbed the broken palings and reposed among the flowers. Grass grew on the threshold, and the swinging lattice creaking to the wind gave signal of utter desertion. The sky was blue above, and the air impregnated with fragrance by the rare flowers that grew among the weeds. The trees moved overhead, awakening nature's favorite melody, but the melancholy appearance of the choked paths and weed-grown flower-beds dimmed even this gay summer scene. The time when, in proud and happy security, we assembled at this cottage was gone. Soon the present hours would join those past, and shadows of future ones rose dark and menacing from the womb of time, their cradle and their bier. For the first time in my life I envied the sleep of the dead, and thought with pleasure of one's bed under the sod, where grief and fear have no power. I passed through the gap of the broken paling. I felt, while I disdained the choking tears, I rushed into the depths of the forest. O death and change, rulers of our life, where are ye, that I may grapple with you? What was there in our tranquillity that excited your envy, in our happiness that ye should destroy it? We were happy, loving, and beloved. The horn of Amalthea contained no blessing unshowered upon us, but, alas, quote, La fortuna de dad barbara importuna, o cadaver y ayer flor no permanece jamás. End quote from Calderone de la Barca. As I wandered on, thus ruminating, a number of country people passed me. They seemed full of careful thought, and a few words of their conversation reached me, induced me to approach and make further enquiries. A party of people flying from London, as was frequent in those days, had come up the Thames in a boat. No one at Windsor would afford them shelter, so, going a little further up, they remained all night in a deserted hut near Bolter's Lock. They pursued their way the following morning, leaving one of their company behind them, sick of the plague. This circumstance once spread abroad, none dared approach within half a mile of the infected neighborhood, and the deserted wretch was left to fight with disease and death in solitude as best he might. I was urged by compassion to hasten to the hut for the purpose of ascertaining his situation and administering to his wants. As I advanced, I met knots of country people talking earnestly of this event. Distant as they were from the apprehended contagion, fear was impressed on every countenance. I passed by a group of these terrorists in a lane in the direct road to the hut. One of them stopped me and, conjecturing that I was ignorant of the circumstance, told me not to go on, for that an infected person lay but at a short distance. I know it, I replied, and I am going to see in what condition the poor fellow is. A murmur of surprise and horror ran through the assembly. I continued, This poor wretch is deserted, dying, succorless. In these unhappy times, God knows how soon any or all of us may be in like want. I am going to do as I would be done by. But you will never be able to return to the castle. Lady Idris, his children, in confused speech were the words that struck my ear. Do you not know, my friends, I said, that the Earl himself, now Lord Protector, visits daily not only those probably infected by this disease, but the hospitals and pest houses, going near and even touching the sick, yet he was never in better health. You labor under an entire mistake as to the nature of the plague, but do not fear. I do not ask any of you to accompany me, nor to believe me, until I return safe and sound from my patient. So I left them and hurried on. I soon arrived at the hut. The door was ajar. I entered, and one glance assured me that its former inhabitant was no more. He lay on a heap of straw, cold and stiff, while a pernicious effluvia filled the room, and various stains and marks served to show the virulence of the disorder. I had never before beheld one killed by pestilence. While every mind was full of dismay at its effects, a craving for excitement had led us to peruse Defoe's account and the masterly delineations of the author of Arthur Mervyn. The pictures drawn in these books were so vivid that we seemed to have experienced the results depicted by them, but cold were the sensations excited by words, burning though they were, and describing the death and misery of thousands, compared to what I felt in looking on the corpse of this unhappy stranger. This indeed was the plague. I raised his rigid limbs. I marked the distortion of his face and the stony eyes lost to perception. As I was thus occupied, chill horror congealed my blood, making my flesh quiver and my hair to stand on end. Half insanely I spoke to the dead. "So the plague killed you," I muttered. "How came this? Was the coming painful? You look as if the enemy had tortured before he murdered you." And now I leapt up precipitately and escaped from the hut before nature could revoke her laws and inorganic words be breathed in answer from the lips of the departed. On returning through the lane, I saw at a distance the same assemblage of persons which I had left. They hurried away as soon as they saw me. My agitated mien added to their fear of coming near one who had entered within the verge of contagion. At a distance from facts, one draws conclusions which appear infallible, which yet when put to the test of reality vanish like unreal dreams. I had ridiculed the fears of my countrymen when they related to others. Now that they came home to myself, I paused. The Rubicon, I felt, was past, and it behooved me well to reflect what I should do on this hither side of disease and danger. According to the vulgar superstition, my dress, my person, the air I breathed, bore in it mortal danger to myself and others. Should I return to the castle, to my wife and children, with this taint upon me? Not, surely, if I were infected, but I felt certain that I was not. A few hours would determine the question. I would spend these in the forest, in reflection on what was to come, and what my future actions were to be. In the feeling communicated to me by the sight of one struck by the plague, I forgot the events that had excited me so strongly in London. New and more painful prospects, by degrees, were cleared of the mist which had hitherto veiled them. The question was no longer whether I should share Adrian's toils and danger, but in what manner I could, in Windsor and the neighbourhood, imitate the prudence and zeal which, under his government, produced order and plenty in London. And how, now pestilence had spread more widely, I could secure the health of my own family. I spread the whole earth out as a map before me. On no one spot of its surface could I put my finger and say, "Here is safety." In the south, the disease, virulent and immedicable, had nearly annihilated the race of man. Storm and inundation, poisonous winds and blights filled up the measure of suffering. In the north it was worse. The lesser population gradually declined, and famine and plague kept watch on the survivors who, helpless and feeble, were ready to fall an easy prey into their hands. I contracted my view to England. The overgrown metropolis, the great heart of mighty Britain, was pulseless. Commerce had ceased. All resort for ambition or pleasure was cut off. The streets were grass-grown, the houses empty. The few that from necessity remained seemed already branded with the taint of inevitable pestilence. In the larger manufacturing towns, the same tragedy was acted on a smaller yet more disastrous scale. There was no Adrian to superintend and direct, while whole flocks of the poor were struck and killed. Yet we were not all to die. No, truly, though thinned, the race of man would continue, and the great plague would, in after years, become matter of history and wonder. Doubtless this visitation was for extent unexampled. More need that we should work hard to dispute its progress. Ere this men have gone out in sport and slain their thousands and tens of thousands, but now man had become a creature of price. The life of one of them was of more worth than the so-called treasures of kings. Look at his thought-endued countenance, his graceful limbs, his majestic brow, his wondrous mechanism. The type and model of this best work of God is not to be cast aside as a broken vessel. He shall be preserved, and his children and his children's children carry down the name and form of man to latest time. Above all, I must guard those entrusted by nature and fate to my especial care. And surely, if among all my fellow creatures I were to select those who might stand forth examples of the greatness and goodness of man, I could choose no other than those allied to me by the most sacred ties. Some from among the family of man must survive, and these should be among the survivors. That should be my task. To accomplish it in my own life were a small sacrifice. There then in that castle, in Windsor Castle, birthplace of Idris and my babes, should be the haven and retreat for the wrecked bark of human society. Its forest should be our world, its garden afford us food. Within its walls I would establish the shaken throne of health. I was an outcast and a vagabond, when Adrian gently threw over me the silver net of love and civilization, and linked me inextricably to human charities and human excellence. I was one who, though an aspirant after good and an ardent lover of wisdom, was yet unenrolled in any list of worth, when Idris, the princely born, who was herself the personification of all that was divine in woman, she who walked the earth like a poet's dream, as a carved goddess endued with sense, or pictured saint stepping from the canvas, she, the most worthy, chose me and gave me herself, a priceless gift. During several hours I continued thus to meditate, till hunger and fatigue brought me back to the passing hour, then marked by long shadows cast from the descending sun. I had wandered towards Bracknell, far to the west of Windsor. The feeling of perfect health which I enjoyed assured me that I was free from contagion. I remembered that Idris had been kept in ignorance of my proceedings. She might have heard of my return from London and my visit to Bolter's Lock, which, connected with my continued absence, might tend greatly to alarm her. I returned to Windsor by the long walk, and, passing through the town towards the castle, I found it in a state of agitation and disturbance. It is too late to be ambitious, says Sir Thomas Browne. We cannot hope to live so long in our names as some have done in their persons. One face of Janus holds no proportion to the other. Upon this text, many fanatics arose who prophesied that the end of time was come. The spirit of superstition had birth from the wreck of our hopes, and antics wild and dangerous were played on the great theatre, while the remaining particle of futurity dwindled into a point in the eyes of the prognosticators. Weak-spirited women died of fear as they listened to their denunciations. Men of robust form and seeming strength fell into idiocy and madness, racked by the dread of coming eternity. A man of this kind was now pouring forth his eloquent despair among the inhabitants of Windsor. The scene of the morning and my visit to the dead, which had been spread abroad, had alarmed the country people, so they had become fit instruments to be played upon by a maniac. The poor wretch had lost his young wife and lovely infant by the plague. He was a mechanic and, rendered unable to attend to the occupation which supplied his necessities, famine was added to his other miseries. He left the chamber which contained his wife and child no more, but dead earth upon the earth. Wild with hunger, watching, and grief, his diseased fancy made him believe himself sent by heaven to preach the end of time to the world. He entered the churches and foretold to the congregations their speedy removal to the vaults below. He appeared like the forgotten spirit of the time in the theatres, and bade the spectators go home and die. He had been seized and confined. He had escaped and wandered from London among the neighbouring towns, and, with frantic gestures and thrilling words, he unveiled to each their hidden fears, and gave voice to the soundless thought they dared not syllable. He stood under the arcade of the town hall of Windsor, and from this elevation harangued a trembling crowd. "Hear, O ye inhabitants of the earth," he cried. "Hear thou, all-seeing, but most pitiless heaven. Hear thou too, O tempest-tossed heart, which breathes out these words, yet faints beneath their meaning. Death is among us. The earth is beautiful and flower-bedecked, but she is our grave. The clouds of heaven weep for us. The pageantry of the stars is but our funeral torchlight. Grey-headed men, ye hoped for yet a few years in your long-known abode, but the lease is up, you must remove. Children, ye will never reach maturity. Even now the small grave is dug for ye. Mothers, clasp them in your arms, one death embraces you." Shuddering, he stretched out his hands. His eyes, cast up, seemed bursting from their sockets, while he appeared to follow shapes, to us invisible, in the yielding air. "There they are," he cried, "the dead. They rise in their shrouds and pass in silent procession towards the far land of their doom. Their bloodless lips move not. Their shadowy limbs are void of motion, while still they glide onwards. We come," he exclaimed, springing forwards. "For what should we wait? Haste, my friends, apparel yourselves in the court dress of death. Pestilence will usher you to his presence. Why thus long? They, the good, the wise, and the beloved, are gone before. Mothers, kiss you last. Husbands, protectors no more, lead on the partners of your death. Come, oh come, while the dear ones are yet in sight, for soon they will pass away, and we never, never shall join them more." From such ravings as these, he would suddenly become collected, and with unexaggerated but terrific words, paint the horrors of the time, describe with minute detail the effects of the plague on the human frame, and tell heart-breaking tales of the snapping of dear affinities. The gasping horror of despair over the deathbed of the last beloved, so that groans and even shrieks burst from the crowd. One man in particular stood in front, his eyes fixed on the prophet, his mouth open, his limbs rigid, while his face changed to various colors, yellow, blue, and green through intense fear. The maniac caught his glance and turned his eye on him. One has heard of the gaze of the rattlesnake, which allures the trembling victim till he falls within his jaws. The maniac became composed. His person rose higher. Authority beamed from his countenance. He looked on the peasant, who began to tremble while he still gazed. His knees knocked together, his teeth chattered. He at last fell down in convulsions. "That man has the plague," said the maniac calmly. A shriek burst from the lips of the poor wretch, and then sudden motionlessness came over him. It was manifest to all that he was dead. Cries of horror filled the place. Everyone endeavored to effect his escape. In a few minutes the market-place was cleared. The corpse lay on the ground, and the maniac, subdued and exhausted, sat beside it, leaning his gaunt cheek upon his thin hand. Soon some people, deputed by the magistrates, came to remove the body. The unfortunate being saw a jailer in each. He fled precipitately, while I passed onwards to the castle. Death, cruel and relentless, had entered these beloved walls. An old servant, who had nursed Idris in infancy, and who lived with us more on the footing of a revered relative than a domestic, had gone a few days before to visit a daughter married and settled in the neighbourhood of London. On the night of her return she sickened of the plague. From the haughty and unbending nature of the Countess of Windsor, Idris had few tender filial associations with her. This good woman had stood in the place of a mother, and her very deficiencies of education and knowledge, by rendering her humble and defenceless, endeared her to us. She was the especial favourite of the children. I found my poor girl, there is no exaggeration in the expression, wild with grief and dread. She hung over the patient in agony, which was not mitigated when her thoughts wandered towards her babes, for whom she feared infection. My arrival was like the newly discovered lamp of a lighthouse to sailors who are weathering some dangerous point. She deposited her appalling doubts in my hands. She relied on my judgment, and was comforted by my participation in her sorrow. Soon our poor nurse expired, and the anguish of suspense was changed to deep regret, which, though at first more painful, yet yielded with greater readiness to my consolations. Sleep, the sovereign balm, at length steeped her tearful eyes in forgetfulness. She slept, and quiet prevailed in the castle, whose inhabitants were hushed to repose. I was awake, and during the long hours of dead night, my busy thoughts worked in my brain like 10,000 mill wheels, rapid, acute, untamable. All slept, all England slept, and from my window, commanding a wide prospect of the star-illumined country, I saw the land stretched out in placid rest. I was awake, alive, while the brother of death possessed my race. What if the more potent of these fraternal deities should obtain dominion over it? The silence of midnight, to speak truly, though apparently a paradox, rung in my ears. The solitude became intolerable. I placed my hand on the beating heart of Idris. I bent my head to catch the sound of her breath, to assure myself that she still existed. For a moment, I doubted whether I should not awake her, so effeminate a horror ran through my frame. Great God! Would it one day be thus? One day all extinct save myself, should I walk the earth alone? Were these warning voices, whose inarticulate and oracular sense forced belief upon me. Quote, "Yet I would not call them voices of warning that announce to us only the inevitable. As the sun, ere it is risen, sometimes paints its image in the atmosphere, so often do the spirits of great events stride on before the events, and in today already walks tomorrow." End quote from Coleridge's translation of Schiller's Wallenstein. Chapter 8. After a long interval, I am again impelled by the restless spirit within me to continue my narration, but I must alter the mode which I have hitherto adopted. The details contained in the foregoing pages, apparently trivial, yet each slightest one weighing like a lead in the depressed scale of human afflictions. This tedious dwelling on the sorrows of others, while my own were only in apprehension, this slowly laying bare of my soul's wounds, this journal of death, this long-drawn and tortuous path, leading to the ocean of countless tears, awakens me again to keen grief. I had used this history as an opiate. While it described my beloved friends, fresh with life and glowing with hope, active assistants on the scene, I was soothed. There will be a more melancholy pleasure in painting the end of it all. But the intermediate steps, the climbing the wall, raised up between what was and is, while I still looked back nor saw the concealed desert beyond, is a labor past my strength. Time and experience have placed me on a height from which I can comprehend the past as a whole, and in this way I must describe it, bringing forward the leading incidents and disposing light and shade so as to form a picture in whose very darkness there will be harmony. It would be needless to narrate those disastrous occurrences for which a parallel might be found in any slighter visitation of our gigantic calamity. Does the reader wish to hear of the pest houses where death is the comforter, of the mournful passage of the death cart, of the insensibility of the worthless and the anguish of the loving heart, of harrowing shrieks and silence dire, of the variety of disease, desertion, famine, despair, and death? There are many books which can feed the appetite craving for these things. Let them turn to the accounts of Boccaccio, Defoe, and Browne. The vast annihilation that has swallowed all things, the voiceless solitude of the once busy earth, the lonely state of singleness which hems me in, has deprived even such details of their stinging reality, and mellowing the lurid tints of past anguish with poetic hues, I am able to escape from the mosaic of circumstance by perceiving and reflecting back the grouping and combined coloring of the past. I had returned from London, possessed by the idea, with the intimate feeling that it was my first duty to secure, as well as I was able, the well-being of my family, and then to return and take my post beside Adrian. The events that immediately followed on my arrival at Windsor changed this view of things. The plague was not in London alone. It was everywhere. It came on us, as Ryland had said, like 1,000 packs of wolves, howling through the winter night, gaunt and fierce. When once disease was introduced into the rural districts, its effects appeared more horrible, more exigent, and more difficult to cure than in towns. There was a companionship in suffering there, and the neighbors keeping constant watch on each other, and inspired by the active benevolence of Adrian, succor was afforded, and the path of destruction smoothed. But in the country, among the scattered farmhouses, in lone cottages, in fields and barns, tragedies were acted harrowing to the soul, unseen, unheard, unnoticed. Medical aid was less easily procured, food was more difficult to obtain, and human beings, unwithheld by shame, for they were unbeheld of their fellows, ventured on deeds of greater wickedness, or gave way more readily to their abject fears. Deeds of heroism also occurred, whose very mention swells the heart and brings tears into the eyes. Such is human nature, that beauty and deformity are often closely linked. In reading history, we are chiefly struck by the generosity and self-devotion that follows close on the heels of crime, veiling with supernal flowers the stain of blood. Such acts were not wanting to adorn the grim train that waited on the progress of the plague. The inhabitants of Berkshire and Bucks had been long aware that the plague was in London, in Liverpool, Bristol, Manchester, York, in short, in all the more populous towns of England. They were not, however, the less astonished and dismayed when it appeared among themselves. They were impatient and angry in the midst of terror. They would do something to throw off the clinging evil, and, while in action, they fancied that a remedy was applied. The inhabitants of the smaller towns left their houses, pitched tents in the fields, wandering separate from each other, careless of hunger or the sky's inclemency, while they imagined that they avoided the death-dealing disease. The farmers and cottagers, on the contrary, struck with the fear of solitude and madly desirous of medical assistance, flocked into the towns. But winter was coming, and with winter, hope. In August, the plague had appeared in the country of England, and during September it made its ravages. Towards the end of October, it dwindled away, and was in some degree replaced by a typhus of hardly less virulence. The autumn was warm and rainy. The infirm and sickly died off. Happier they, many young people flushed with health and prosperity, made pale by wasting malady, became the inhabitants of the grave. The crop had failed, the bad corn and want of foreign wines added vigor to disease. Before Christmas, half England was under water. The storms of the last winter were renewed, but the diminished shipping of this year caused us to feel less the tempests of the sea. The flood and storms did more to harm continental Europe than to us, giving, as it were, the last blow to the calamities which destroyed it. In Italy, the rivers were unwatched by the diminished peasantry, and, like wild beasts from their lair when the hunters and dogs are afar, did Tiber, Arno, and Po rush upon and destroy the fertility of the plains. Whole villages were carried away. Rome and Florence and Pisa were overflowed, and their marble palaces, late mirrored in tranquil streams, had their foundations shaken by their winter-gifted power. In Germany and Russia, the injury was still more momentous. But frost would come at last, and with it a renewal of our lease of earth. Frost would blunt the arrows of pestilence, and enchain the furious elements, and the land would in spring throw off her garment of snow, released from her menace of destruction. It was not until February that the desired signs of winter appeared. For 3 days the snow fell, ice stopped the current of the rivers, and the birds flew out from crackling branches of the frost-whitened trees. On the 4th morning all vanished. A southwest wind brought up rain. The sun came out, and mocking the usual laws of nature, seemed even at this early season to burn with solstitial force. It was no consolation that with the first winds of March the lanes were filled with violets, the fruit trees covered with blossoms, that the corn sprung up, and the leaves came out, forced by the unseasonable heat. We feared the balmy air, we feared the cloudless sky, the flower-covered earth, and delightful woods, for we looked on the fabric of the universe no longer as our dwelling, but our tomb, and the fragrant land smelled to the apprehension of fear like a wide churchyard. Quote, Pisando la tierra dura, de continuo el hombre está, y cada paso que da es sobre su sepultura. End quote. From Calderone de la Barca. Yet, notwithstanding these disadvantages, winter was breathing time, and we exerted ourselves to make the best of it. Plague might not revive with the summer, but if it did, it should find us prepared. It is a part of man's nature to adapt itself through habit even to pain and sorrow. Pestilence had become a part of our future, our existence. It was to be guarded against, like the flooding of rivers, the encroachments of ocean, or the inclemency of the sky. After long suffering and bitter experience, some panacea might be discovered. As it was, all that received infection died. All, however, were not infected. And it became our part to fix deep the foundations and raise high the barrier between contagion and the sane. To introduce such order as would conduce to the well-being of the survivors, and as would preserve hope and some portion of happiness to those who were spectators of the still renewed tragedy. Adrian had introduced systematic modes of proceeding in the metropolis which, while they were unable to stop the progress of death, yet prevented other evils, vice and folly, from rendering the awful fate of the hour still more tremendous. I wished to imitate his example, but men are used to, quote, move all together if they move at all, end quote, from Wordsworth. And I could find no means of leading the inhabitants of scattered towns and villages, who forgot my words as soon as they heard them not, and veered with every baffling wind that might arise from an apparent change of circumstance. I adopted another plan. Those writers who have imagined a reign of peace and happiness on earth have generally described a rural country where each small township was directed by the elders and wise men. This was the key of my design. Each village, however small, usually contains a leader, one among themselves whom they venerate, whose advice they seek in difficulty, and whose good opinion they chiefly value. I was immediately drawn to make this observation by occurrences that presented themselves to my personal experience. In the village of Little Marlow, an old woman ruled the community. She had lived for some years in an almshouse and on fine Sundays her threshold was constantly beset by a crowd, seeking her advice and listening to her admonitions. She had been a soldier's wife, and had seen the world. Infirmity, induced by fevers caught in unwholesome quarters, had come on her before its time, and she seldom moved from her little cot. The plague entered the village, and while fright and grief deprived the inhabitants of the little wisdom they possessed, old Martha stepped forward and said, "Before now I have been in a town where there was the plague." "And you escaped?" "No, but I recovered." After this, Martha was seated more firmly than ever on the regal seat, elevated by reverence and love. She entered the cottages of the sick. She relieved their wants with her own hand. She betrayed no fear, and inspired all who saw her with some portion of her own native courage. She attended the markets. She insisted upon being supplied with food for those who were too poor to purchase it. She showed them how the well-being of each included the prosperity of all. She would not permit the gardens to be neglected, nor the very flowers in the cottage lattices to droop from want of care. Hope, she said, was better than a doctor's prescription, and everything that could sustain and enliven the spirits of more worth than drugs and mixtures. It was the sight of little Marlowe and my conversations with Martha that led me to the plan I formed. I had before visited the manor houses and gentlemen's seats, and often found the inhabitants actuated by the purest benevolence, ready to lend their utmost aid for the welfare of their tenants. But this was not enough. The intimate sympathy generated by similar hopes and fears, similar experience and pursuits, was wanting here. The poor perceived that the rich possessed other means of preservation than those which could be partaken of by themselves. Seclusion and, as far as circumstances permitted, freedom from care. They could not place reliance on them, but turned with tenfold dependence to the succor and advice of their equals. I resolved, therefore, to go from village to village, seeking out the rustic archon of the place, and by systematizing their exertions and enlightening their views, increase both their power and their use among their fellow cottagers. Many changes also now occurred in these spontaneous regal elections. Depositions and abdications were frequent, while, in the place of the old and prudent, the ardent youth would step forward, eager for action, regardless of danger. Often, too, the voice to which all listened was suddenly silenced, the helping hand cold, the sympathetic eye closed, and the villagers feared still more the death that had selected a choice victim, shivering in dust the heart that had beat for them, reducing to incommunicable annihilation the mind forever occupied with projects for their welfare. Whoever labors for man must often find ingratitude, watered by vice and folly, spring from the grain which he has sown. Death, which had in our younger days walked the earth like a thief that comes in the night, now, rising from his subterranean vault, girt with power, with dark banner floating, came a conqueror. Many saw, seated above his vice-regal throne, a supreme providence who directed his shafts and guided his progress, and they bowed their heads in resignation, or at least in obedience. Others perceived only a passing casualty. They endeavored to exchange terror for heedlessness, and plunged into licentiousness to avoid the agonizing throes of worst apprehension. Thus, while the wise, the good, and the prudent were occupied by the labors of benevolence, the truce of winter produced other effects among the young, the thoughtless, and the vicious. During the colder months, there was a general rush to London in search of amusement. The ties of public opinion were loosened. Many were rich, heretofore poor. Many had lost father and mother, the guardians of their morals, their mentors and restraints. It would have been useless to have opposed these impulses by barriers, which would only have driven those actuated by them to more pernicious indulgencies. The theatres were open and thronged. Dance and midnight festival were frequented. In many of these decorum was violated, and the evils, which hitherto adhered to an advanced state of civilization, were doubled. The student left his books, the artist his study. The occupations of life were gone, but the amusements remained. Enjoyment might be protracted to the verge of the grave. All factitious coloring disappeared. Death rose like night, and, protected by its murky shadows, the blush of modesty, the reserve of pride, the decorum of prudery were frequently thrown aside as useless veils. This was not universal. Among better natures, anguish and dread, the fear of eternal separation, and the awful wonder produced by unprecedented calamity, drew closer the ties of kindred and friendship. Philosophers opposed their principles as barriers to the inundation of profligacy or despair, and the only ramparts to protect the invaded territory of human life. The religious, hoping now for their reward, clung fast to their creeds, as the rafts and planks which, over the tempest-vexed sea of suffering, would bear them in safety to the harbor of the unknown continent. The loving heart, obliged to contract its view, bestowed its overflow of affection in triple portion on the few that remained. Yet, even among these, the present, as an unalienable possession, became all of time to which they dared commit the precious freight of their hopes. The experience of immemorial time had taught us formerly to count our enjoyments by years, and extend our prospect of life through a lengthened period of progression and decay. The long road threaded a vast labyrinth, and the valley of the shadow of death in which it terminated was hid by intervening objects. But an earthquake had changed the scene. Under our very feet the earth yawned. Deep and precipitous, the gulf below opened to receive us, while the hours charioted us towards the chasm. But it was winter now, and months must elapse before we are hurled from our security. We became ephemera, to whom the interval between the rising and setting sun was as a long-drawn year of common time. We should never see our children ripen into maturity, nor behold their downy cheeks roughen, their blithe hearts subdued by passion or care. But we had them now. They lived, and we lived. What more could we desire? With such schooling did my poor Idris try to hush thronging fears, and in some measure succeeded. It was not as in summer-time, when each hour might bring the dreaded fate. Until summer we felt sure, and this certainty, short-lived as it must be, yet for a while satisfied her maternal tenderness. I know not how to express or communicate the sense of concentrated, intense, though evanescent transport that imparadised us in the present hour. Our joys were dearer because we saw their end. They were keener because we felt, to its fullest extent, their value. They were purer because their essence was sympathy. As a meteor is brighter than a star, did the felicity of this winter contain in itself the extracted delights of a long, long life. How lovely is spring! As we looked from Windsor Terrace on the 16 fertile counties spread beneath, speckled by happy cottages and wealthier towns, all looked as in former years, heart-cheering and fair. The land was ploughed, the slender blades of wheat broke through the dark soil, the fruit trees were covered with buds, the husbandman was abroad in the fields, the milkmaid tripped home with well-filled pails. The swallows and martins struck the sunny pools with their long pointed wings, the new-dropped lambs reposed on the young grass, the tender growth of leaves, quote, lifts its sweet head into the air and feeds a silent space with ever-sprouting green, end quote from Keats. Man himself seemed to regenerate and feel the frost of winter yield to an elastic and warm renewal of life. Reason told us that care and sorrow would grow with the opening year, but how to believe the ominous voice breathed up with pestiferous vapors from fear's dim cavern, while nature, laughing and scattering from her green lap flowers and fruits and sparkling waters, invited us to join the gay mask of young life she led upon the scene. Stay tuned for the next segment from The Last Man by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find many interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.